Today's scripture reading is from the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, chapter 27, verses 18 to 36. He went to his father and said, "My father." "Yes, my son," he answered. "Who is it?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing." Isaac asked his son, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" "The Lord your God gave me success," he replied. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not." Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So he proceeded to bless him. "Are you really my son Esau?" he asked. "I am," he replied. Then he said, "My son, bring me some of your game to eat so that I may give you my blessing." Jacob brought it to him and he ate, and he brought some wine and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come here, my son, and kiss me." So he went to him and kissed him. When Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he blessed him and said,
The smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. After Isaac finished blessing him, and Jacob had scarcely left his father's presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. He too prepared some tasty food and brought it to his father. Then he said to him, "My father, please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing." His father Isaac asked him, "Who are you?" "I am your son," he answered, "your firstborn, Esau." Isaac trembled violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it just before you came, and I blessed him, and indeed he will be blessed." When Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me. Me too, my father." But he said, "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." Esau said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taking my blessing." Then he asked, "Haven't you reserved any blessing for me?" This is God's word.
Are you all costume people? I was thinking about that this week. It is Halloween, I guess. But I was trying to think about what people like about costumes. So I'm putting my cards on the table. I'm not like a big dress-up person. But I was thinking there's at least two things that costumes and disguises accomplish or do for us. One is that it gives us access to some kind of secret information or some kind of place that we want to go that we can't unless we're in disguise. If any of you are familiar with the greatest action movie franchise ever, Mission Impossible, there's always a mask in one of those movies, right? There's always some kind of disguise element to those films. On the other hand, there's delight and shock, right? Maybe you've seen YouTube videos where like an NBA player dresses up as like an average Joe and goes out to play basketball. And then you find out like, oh my goodness, like this person's really good. The most terrifying costume of which I'm aware, a little bit of a warning here, I'm about to put it up. This is the scariest costume I've ever seen. You can go ahead and put it up. This is the Burger King mascot. I have no idea what deranged person came up with this idea for a mascot. I get it, it's a king, very terrifying. My college roommate senior year bought the Burger King mascot costume. And we got this idea that we would go to Burger King in the Burger King costume, my friend did, and we would buy a bunch of Whoppers, and then we'd hand them out during finals week at the library just to see what would happen. I think we have that one too. So that's my friend Bo walking into the library, and we just filmed it all. We just wanted to see what people would do. You can tell we were really popular. We hung out in the cool crowd at college. But the costume experience, right? The idea of dressing up as someone else it is at its very core and very nature a performance. It's something we do either to gain something or something we do to create something like shock and awe and delight or whatever it might be. And in this passage today, we see a costume. I don't know, maybe in a certain way, the first real costume in the book of Genesis, although there's a little bit of disguising and passing people off as someone else. That's already happened in the story. So it seems there's something primordial at the heart of human experience that whoever we are, we want to be, in certain seasons, someone else. And that is certainly true for Jacob. And there's also this interesting element, if you were here last week, I just want to explain up front, which is that this is kind of part 2 of the Jacob and Esau story. And if you're kind of feeling like it feels a little redundant, you're like, no, wait, last week, Jacob deceived Esau to get his birthright, and now he's deceiving to get the blessing. How do those fit together? The birthright is to do with material possession, the inheritance of the family, all sorts of things like that. The blessing is where the patriarch, Isaac, the father, says, you are going to be the one to carry on the torch of God's promises for our family. So there's this kind of twofold thing, the strategy, this long view that Jacob has, where he's trying to manipulate, to deceive, to connive, in order to get both the material promises of his family and the spiritual promises of his family. This is continuing a sermon series, not just on Jacob and Esau, but on the entire Genesis narrative in a lot of ways, about the formative experiences of people trying to understand who God is and what he wants from us. And we're calling that series, I think appropriately, Wrestling with God. Because at the very core of our experience, the disparity, the gap between us as finite people and God as infinite sovereign Lord is so great that how could we expect to do anything other than wrestle? And in this story, we see someone who isn't yet wrestling. Jacob has not yet had the encounter that we'll talk about in coming weeks where he literally wrestles with God. He's still trying to find a way to avoid the pain of wrestling with God, and he's using costumes and disguises and manipulation to do that. He's being a wolf in sheep's clothing, a Jacob in Esau's clothing. And so one of the things that I think we need to talk about today is why we are so attracted to dressing up as someone or something else. Why is it that the experience of waiting on God and wrestling with God is so challenging to us, or so maybe unsettling for us, that we'd prefer to find our own means to receive the blessings that he promises? And if you want to put that in a really, really simple way, and this may be frustrating to hear, it's frustrating for me to say, is that waiting on the promises of God is the fundamental definition of what it means to have faith. And that all of our attempts to manipulate, to strong arm, to turn life toward us in some sort of ownership way, while that can sometimes be helpful, more often than not, it is disruptive for our faith journey. This is one thing that, if I'm going to kind of give some credit, if you are familiar with kind of like New Age thinking and a lot of secular belief systems, there's this idea that we need to find the rhythm and match our rhythm to the rhythm of the universe. Maybe you've heard people say this, it's just, you just want to kind of get aligned with the forces of the world around us. I don't think they're off. I wouldn't put it that way. I'd say that the experience of wrestling with God is an experience in which we are angling toward finding the rhythm of who God is and trying to match our own heart and our own rhythm to that. The Christian life is far more about belief than behavior. It's far more about faith than feverish performativity. And it's far more about trust than terror in the face of our doubts. And so this morning we see an example in the negative of someone who has not yet learned to lean into that waiting and that faith and that trust. And so he dons dangerous disguises, my first point, in order to receive what can only be broken blessings. And then finally, he has yet to see, as his name suggests, that he is not the one that grasps God. God will be the one that grasps him through what we call grace. And that is gracious grasping. So dangerous disguises, broken blessings, and gracious grasping. In the story of Jacob and Esau, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, Jacob is wrestling with anyone but God, right? He's out for blood on all sorts of levels. He's contending with his brother, of course, and that will get even messier. He's contending with his father, who has not selected him to receive the birthright or the blessing, which is a question in and of itself. And he's also contending with his mother, who, while on his side, is always kind of trying to push him forward or put him up to these dangerous disguises. In this family and in this house, there is anything but trust. It is a broken system. It is a broken family of origin. And I think that's why it's appropriate that we are trying to have that conversation next week after church about family of origin, because actually when you go back to the beginning of human history, the beginning of the Bible story about what it means to be human, it doesn't take long to find out that family and its brokenness settles in pretty early. In fact, the first children to ever exist, Cain and Abel, had their own brokenness. So what do we learn about Jacob through this experience, through his donning of this costume? Look at verse 19. Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing. Now, if this was a movie and you were watching the story of Genesis play out, this is where you or someone you're sitting with would lean next to you and go, saw this one coming, right? If you've been following the story of Jacob, he is never resting. He is never not trying to come up with a strategy to get ahead in life. And Isaac, to his credit, despite being old and losing sight and all sorts of, has a lot of infirmity, he's nearing the end of his life. Despite all of those things, he is suspicious. He does say this, right? In verse 20, how did you find it so quickly, my son? He knows something's off, right? It reminds me of this quote from Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes series, where he says, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. It's a little bit cynical, I know, but I think what he's saying is that our world is full of so much brokenness, so much deception, so many disguises, that sometimes just stating the obvious thing, asking the obvious question, is more deceptive in a strange way than trying to contend with what really is true out there. I wonder if you've ever felt this way, that there's just so many systems of brokenness in our world and our life that it's hard to know what's true, especially in our age and our time where you go on the internet and you read all sorts of hot takes. You go, I don't know how I would arrive at a point where I would know fact from fiction, truth from falsehood. And in that story are people like Jacob, who knows that as well and is playing to our weaknesses, playing to our doubts. This is where it gets really interesting for me. There's a joke, when I was doing my PhD, there's a joke that every doctoral student writing a dissertation, about halfway or later through writing that book-length dissertation, realizes the project they wish they had written. And then they have to decide whether they start over or they just finish something that they're no longer interested in. I've heard this story over and over again. What I will say is that every time I prepare a message like this, I get halfway through and I'm like, that's the sermon, or that's the thing, right? I'll tell you in a minute why I feel that way about this. But then again, I also think if I'd given you 20 minutes on the topic that I'm really interested in, you might have walked out the door. Let me tell you why. Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So he proceeded to bless him. I think this is fascinating. Of all the ways that Jacob could test, which son is this? I'm feeling suspicious. I'm feeling like there's some deception. Doesn't feel his face. He doesn't have him stand up and try to measure his height. I imagine there might have been some differences there. Who knows how well he knew his son's height, how involved he was in their life? I have no idea. All I know is that the thing he goes to test is Jacob's hands. Isn't that interesting? The voice gives Jacob away a little bit, but when he feels that Jacob's hands mirror the hands of his brother Esau, he is put at ease. Hands give us away. Have you thought about this? That even just speaking metaphorically, hands put into practice or test us whether we are putting our faith into practice, right? We can talk a big game about our spiritual existence. We can talk about our faith and our sanctity and our holiness, but ultimately, as the book of James reminds us in the New Testament, there is some sort of proof in the pudding of where your hands are getting involved. Jacob, as a matter of fact, remember, means to grasp, right? Jacob's very name is about hands and hands being full of something, but not of the promises of God. From the very beginning, his hands are grasping to pull people behind him, to pull them into contention and strife. This is where I say that I'm sparing you all because I spent way too long this week reading about the anthropology of hands, studying different cultures and different occult religions and what people think about hands. If you're interested, find me after. I've got notes and notes on hands. It's the thing that separates us. It's what makes us human, right? We often hear in the sort of evolutionary dialogue about opposable thumbs. Hands are in some form and fashion what make us us. And they're also in the tension between faith and work, in the tension between waiting on God and taking matters into our own hands, as the phrase goes, right? There is something about our hands that reveals something about us. The Hebrew word for hand is the word yad. I will give you this one. And I spent a long time kind of connecting. In Hebrew, what you actually find is there are nouns, and often those nouns become verbs or vice versa. They add a letter on the end or a vowel or something to that nature in order to turn it into an action. So yad is the word for hand. Yadad means to cast a lot, but it can also mean to love or hold something lovingly. There's a whole thing we could do about like why lots and money and loving holdingly are the same word, different time. There's also the word yada, which means to praise or worship. That's the one that people feel is most connected, that in some way the Hebrew people, the ancient biblical people, had a connection between hands and worship. That worship was something you did, not just something you received. But finally, and this is the one that is a little bit more speculative, there's another word, yada, with a different syllable, long story, that means to be revealed or made known. So in some way, there's this word that means hand, and the verb corollary of that means to be revealed or made known. I can't help but think that there's some kind of wordplay happening in the original language where they're saying what Isaac's trying to do is to make something known, to reveal who is this sitting in front of him. And where does he go? He goes to that root, that thing that makes us us. It's not just what we say, it's what we do. I want to feel the hands. Jacob has accounted for this. In some way, he knew that this was about to happen. And so he has put together all these systems so that he knows he will not be caught in his lies. Mark Twain once quipped that if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Jacob has to remember a lot. Jacob has to put hair on top of his hands. He has to put Esau's robes and cloaks on, or his animal garments, so that his smell won't give him away. The one thing he can't change is his voice, which is a whole different topic we could talk about. But what I want to point out is that sometimes we are revealed, not through what we say, but through what we do. In our lives, we can talk a big game, and boy, the church and its people can be good at that, let's be honest. But there's sometimes a question of, what are your hands doing? How generous are you? How servant-minded are you? This is not me being exhortational and challenging you this week, go do this. But I look at my own life, let's make it about me, and I say, I have some doozies. I've got some good lines that I can peddle out there in a Bible study. Get ready, here it comes. And then people leave my house, and I go, I'll never do that. That's not me. My tongue is busy. My hands sometimes are not. And so what we do is often in order to shield from the revelation that we may have some kind of hypocrisy or division in our life, we have to put on costumes. We have to dress up. We have to be performative, because at the end of the day, the more layers we put around us, it's kind of like a defense. Then people won't really see what we're doing. There are 3 ways, briefly, before we move on to the next point, that I think we are tempted to put costumes on. One is in our relationships. This passage is all about the brokenness of family, the brokenness in our relationships. This is so true in the era of online dating. There is a performativity and a posture. You want to put your best foot forward, but sometimes you know in your heart of hearts, this is not really who I am, and that leads to relational conflict and strife. It's interesting even in this kind of passage, because there's this tension in the family about God prophesying to Jacob's mother, Rebekah, that the older will serve the younger. Genesis 25, we talked about that last week. We have to think Isaac knows this, but Isaac refuses to accept this. So it's not just Jacob who's in costume. Isaac is in costume with God as well. There are so many layers and mediations of costumes here. The second area where I think we are tempted to put on costumes is in our work. often we hear in our vocational path or as we try to kind of make it in the world, fake it till you make it. Have you heard this? Maybe some of you followed the Theranos scandal with Elizabeth Holmes and what's happening and what has happened in Silicon Valley. And there's this way in which there's a temptation to posture as if we know something when we might not. And that initial desire just to hide a little bit can sometimes lead to a desire to hide a lot. The third way we are tempted to put on a costume, and the most dangerous way, is within our very self. That we become so used to putting up performative walls to protect against vulnerability and exposure that we kind of lose sight of what's true about us in our very selves. We're trying to be two people at once. We're trying to be two places at the same time. You remember that classic Flintstones episode where it's Fred's anniversary and he's trying to be with his wife Wilma at the drive-in movie theater, but next door is the bowling championship with the water buffaloes, and he's going back and forth. Maybe you remember the scene in Miss Doubtfire as well, and he forgets to take off his bowling hat. I don't know. Have you ever felt like that? That you're trying to live a good life, be a good person, go on the anniversary date with your partner, but whenever she looks away, whenever he looks away, you're running to something else, trying to be someone else, trying to hold two things together. Here's how Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, puts it. He says, above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and for others. And having no respect, he ceases to love. This is a really complicated quote, actually, because if you read that last sentence, you go, well, no, why is that true? Why would lying to myself lead to a point where I can no longer love? It's a bit of a logical syllogism. What he's saying is that if you lie to yourself and to others, it's fundamentally an act of disrespect. It's not trusting the other person to accept you as you are, which may be justified in some situations. But for those people you don't trust, you don't respect them. The question is, when you start lying to people that you do trust and respect, what are you after? You're losing a sense of who to trust, who to respect. And when you lose sight of who to respect and how to offer respect, you have lost the foundation of what it means to love one another. Because at the core, emotions and feelings will wax and wane. Things will come and go in your friendships and your relationships. But if you have respect, you can ferry across the waters of any change. That is one of the reasons that it's called the golden rule when Jesus says to his followers, Mark 12, love your neighbor as yourself. He's saying, he's working backwards down the syllogism. He says, if you love your neighbor as yourself, then you will respect both them and yourself, and you will want truth in that relationship. The danger of lying to yourself is that you're actually deconstructing the foundation of the golden rule itself. And so these are dangerous disguises. And let me put it in a very fine point. This is what is true in Jacob and Esau's story. I think it's true in ours. The danger of disguises is not that you'll get caught. The real danger is that they might work for a while. Who knows how long? You might make it your entire life, but you are not being honest with yourself, with others, or with the one who made you. And so I know that sounds really intense, but that's the problem I think we find ourselves in when we put on these disguises, is that we work so hard not to get caught that when we don't get caught, we never change. And the blessings we receive through those deceptions and those performances can only ever be broken blessings. If you look at the very blessing that that Isaac gives to Jacob, thinking it's Esau, Isaac says this: may nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. For Jacob, I imagine this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because he knows that his father thinks this is Esau. He knows in this moment that Isaac, his own father, wants him to serve his brother. And yet he also has manipulated the situation so that he receives it, not Esau. It's a really painful, painful thing for Jacob to sit there and realize, my father does not love me in the same way he loves my brother. And yet, maybe that makes him feel justified for using the costume in the first place. When Esau comes in later, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to verse 36, he says, isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing. Then he asked, haven't you reserved any blessing for me? It's a painful, painful scene. It reminds me of this story of my niece Barrett when my sister was doing had a lot on her plate. And my parents lived very close to my sister, and she said, will you take the dog for a while? They had a little dog, and the dog stayed, and a week turned into a month, and a month turned into 6 months. Basically, it became my parents' dog, right? And then one day, about a year later, Bear got in trouble, and my sister took away her iPad, and she screamed out, first you gave away my dog, and now my iPad? That's what Esau's doing, right? He's like, first my birthright, now my blessing, have you left nothing for me? And it's a really painful moment, because if you look at verse 33, Isaac, the one who's named he laughs, does not laugh. He trembles. Our best laid plans, whether it be Isaac's or Jacob's or our own, our best laid plans are no match for the sovereign will of God. It's hard to look at the story and not feel a little bit weird about the fact that God prophesied that Jacob would take the birthright, Jacob would take the blessing, Jacob will be the person who carries on the family legacy. But then we look at the way by which he received it, and you go like, was that God's plan? It seems so broken. Does he want us to take matters into our own hands like that? I don't think so. And that's one of the reasons at the beginning I said that it can sometimes be tempting for us to editorialize, to get involved in God's planning, to say, like, why would he do it that way? Let me think about it this way. And that kind of mentality of second-guessing God, which is understandable and it's often called doubt, is one of the temptations that leads us to put on those cloaks and robes, to dress up our hands and try to manipulate the situation, try to take matters into our own hands. But I don't know about you, and this is maybe just my experience, and maybe you're wiser and smarter and more successful at this, but when I have a very bad track record when it comes to taking matters into my own hands. I have a very bad track record. You have never probably seen this, but there's this thing in the Northeast called snow. And my dad showed me this thing when I was learning to drive, where the windshield wipers, they get iced up, and you reach out the driver's side window and you just kind of snap it to get the ice to break off. And so I thought, I got to do that. I was driving through the Cumberland Gap in Maryland. It was really cold, very icy, and I reached out and I snapped it, and it just broke off in my hand. And this woman driving by me in a minivan looked over and did the best double take you've ever seen, just sort of like because I was just holding like a lightning rod, my windshield wiper, outside my window while driving down in a blizzard condition in Maryland. I had to pull off the side of the road. The interesting thing is, when I pulled off to get that fixed, they found something else wrong with my car, my tire, and everything was closing for the day. And so in that broken situation that I messed up, deliverance came. Maybe you have stories like that, where it's like unexpected blessings in the midst of poor decisions. The thing about costumes is that they can only receive and they can only deliver to us these partial or broken blessings, because we're not being honest with ourselves, and we're not being honest with others, and we certainly aren't being honest with God. The performance of Jacob's strategy works in the short term, but it does not work in the long term. In the long term, the demand and challenge of the Christian life is to be honest and to be vulnerable. That will not often deliver immediate satisfaction. In fact, Brené Brown writes about vulnerability hangover, right? Where you share something and you put that out into the world with somebody, and then maybe you kind of go like, I don't even know, like, what could they possibly do to make me feel okay about this? Sometimes you've received that from people where someone shares something and you have no words. There's a vulnerability hangover because to be honest does not always deliver the immediate results we need. But to be deceptive may give us immediate results that are untenable. Earlier I said that costumes are most dangerous, disguises are most dangerous when they work. Here's the theological reason I said that. It's because they hide our need for others and for God, most especially for God. When we get really good at our performances, it hides our need for God's grace. They're dangerous because they hide our lack. Flannery O'Connor says, to know oneself is above all to know what one lacks. It is to measure oneself against the truth and not the other way around. That is the hardest, most challenging word I can offer on this passage this morning. I don't know where to begin. There are so many lies that we tell ourselves, so many lies that have been told to us. We are the product of both nature, but also nurture. We are the product of narratives people have told us about ourselves that maybe we want to resist, but we don't have the ability to resist. Maybe you have church hurt experiences where you have been told things about your spiritual condition or your state from someone you respected, like a pastor, God forbid. And you have spent your whole life figuring out if that narrative really fits your story or if that was some kind of power play. I know that's real, and I know there are people in this room who have felt that in their life, contending with stories about yourself that either you're telling or someone else is telling about you. And it's so painful that it's easier just to avoid the conversation altogether, to dress up your hands. To be honest, to see ourselves honestly, we must see ourselves through the lens of truth, by which I mean grace. We must see that we are far more broken than we dare imagine and far more loved than we dare dream. And it's in that paradoxical truth that we can be grasped finally by grace. Because our disguises and our schemes and our strategies, they are what the Bible in the Old Testament calls idols. How do you make an idol? You use your hands. You carve something. You build something. You do anything to keep busy rather than sit in the rest and experience of God. And look at Genesis 27:27. What a moment. When Jacob goes to his father, and what does he do? He kissed him. Was that necessary? I don't know. Maybe that was part of his deception. Maybe that's what Esau would have done in his own imaginary, but we don't actually have that in the story. Does it remind you of anyone else? On the night Jesus was betrayed, one of his followers came to him and kissed him. On the night Jesus was turned over to Roman authorities for a kangaroo court and what turned out to be one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in history, it began with a deception, and a cheap one at that. And he was handed over, notice the word hand, to those authorities. In the end of the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews looks back on the entire history that we're talking about in the Genesis narrative to explain that all of these stories in the Genesis narrative are shadows of things that were to come and be fulfilled in Christ Jesus. The writer says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. Isn't that a weird way to record the story? Was that Isaac's faith? Isaac was literally and spiritually in that moment seemingly blind. He didn't know what he was doing. He was deceived, right? But he was also resisting the prophetic voice of the Lord and what the Lord had for his sons. One of the things the writer of Hebrews is showing us is that all of our conniving, all of our manipulation, the mechanisms and the systems by which we try to receive the blessing on our own terms are ultimately nothing in comparison to the God who is working all things out for our good and our flourishing, even when we are walking the other way. Hebrews 11:13, he goes on, he says this is just maybe the best definition of faith that I know. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. That may be hard to hear. That may be the season you're in right now, where faith is looking in the distance, squinting your eyes, not sure which person you're looking at or what truth you're looking at, and saying, I'm going to hold on to faith because the story is full of people who, even when they did the exact opposite, even when they were running the other direction, the grace of God reached out to them. How ironic that Jacob is called the one who grasps, because the story of his life is not about him grasping, it's about God grasping him. It's about being handed over to the goodness of God and becoming vulnerable in his presence. James Baldwin, one of my favorite quotes. Love takes off masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. The love of God is that love. It's the love that pursues us to the bitter end even of himself. The love that helps us to see ourselves honestly in both our brokenness and our blessedness. It's the love that helps us lower all of those walls and defenses and costumes and disguises, and it leaves us neither in nakedness nor in a disguise of our own making. It leaves us, as Paul says in Romans 13, dressed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Because at the end of all things, when we stand before God dressed, clothed, and covered by the one who gave it all away to be the greater Jacob, the one who grasps us even when we are trying to take matters into our own hands. Let's pray. God, help us to see ourselves honestly. Help us to be people who are defined by our vulnerability, not our performativity. Help us to be a church and a people and a community that handles our doubts with care, knowing that you have made us in your image, but we are so far from where you are. May we see you as the constant God in a place and a world that is often defined by inconstancy. Bring us close to you. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.